The cold came early to Harlan County that autumn of 1893, rolling down off the northern ridges like something with a grudge. It pressed against the windows of the Calloway farmhouse before October had even finished, rattling the single pane in the kitchen and working its fingers under the door seam that June had packed twice already with strips of burlap. She stood at the washboard with her sleeves pushed to her elbows, her hands red from the water, and she listened to the wind and did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch. 4 years of widowhood had taught her that particular skill among others: how to split kindling without taking off a finger, how to sweet-talk the bank man in Grover's Crossing long enough to make it through another quarter, how to look at a half-empty larder and calculate it into something that would hold until spring. What she had not yet learned was how to answer the question her boy kept asking her with his eyes, the one he was too old now to ask out loud. He was 11. He understood more than she wished he did. Before that winter was out, she would turn down 7 offers of marriage, each one reasonable in its way, each one wrong in ways she couldn't always name, and she would watch her son Thomas do the things she could not bring herself to do. But that part of the story comes later. First there was the cold and the farm, and the particular morning in early November when Nathan Hale rode in from the Bitterroot with nothing to his name but a good horse, a carpenter's tools, and a letter of inquiry he'd written himself in a hand so careful it looked like it hurt him. That letter was folded in June's apron pocket right now. She had read it 4 times. She was trying to decide if a person could tell anything honest about a man from the way he formed his letters. The answer, she suspected, was not much, but she had very little else to go on. The wind hit the side of the house again, and a thin line of cold slid across the floor and touched her feet through her boot leather. She wrung out the shirt in her hands and hung it over the line strung near the stove, and she went to put another log on the fire, and she thought about the letter, and she thought about spring, and she tried very hard not to think about how far away spring was. Elias Broom had asked first, back in September, before the first frost even. He'd come to the door in his good hat and told her straight out that her farm needed a man, and so did she, and she'd thanked him politely and shut the door before he could finish his second sentence. Elias was not a bad man, but he had a way of looking at the farm first and at June second, and she had noticed that ordering and filed it away. Gerald Potts had come in October, and after him, 2 brothers named Dunmore, who'd apparently decided to let the better-looking one try his luck. Then there was the banker's cousin, and the new school teacher from up in Fork Creek, and the very old widower from the Sutter claim who told her he mostly just needed someone to cook. 7 in all by the time the first snow fell for real. 7 reasonable men, 7 wrong answers. Thomas had watched each one go with a face that gave nothing away, which worried her more than if he'd cried. The letter from Nathan Hale had arrived in mid-October, forwarded through the postmaster in Grover's Crossing, where she had placed a small notice, discreet, plain, factual, the previous spring. She had almost forgotten she'd placed the notice at all. His letter said he was 34 years old, a carpenter by trade, that he had worked mines and ranches and a sawmill in his time, and was not afraid of any kind of honest labor, that he was not a drinking man, and that he understood she would have questions and would welcome them, and that he wanted to say plainly at the outset that he was looking for a fair arrangement and would not misrepresent himself to get one. He had not called himself handsome or said anything about his feelings, and that, June had decided after the 4th reading, was probably the most interesting thing about him. She had written back 2 weeks ago and told him to come if he was serious. She had not expected the letter to land so quickly. She had not expected him to ride in on a Tuesday in the first week of November. 3 days after her reply could have reached the Bitterroot even by fast mail, which meant he had already been on his way when she said yes. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She heard Thomas's boots on the porch before she heard the horse. She heard her son stop walking, and that stillness told her more than any shout would have. She dried her hands and went to the window, and she looked out at the gray yard and the bare cottonwoods along the fence line, and she saw the man on the roan gelding at the gate, sitting still, waiting. He had not come to the door yet. He was waiting at the gate. She looked at that for a moment, and then went to get her coat. He dismounted when he saw her come out, which she took note of. He was tall and spare, with a jaw that needed a razor and eyes the color of a November sky. Not blue exactly, more the shade of something that had been blue and then had weather in it. He held his hat in both hands, and he did not smile. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'm Nathan Hale. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I can come back in 2 days if that's better for you." She looked at him. She looked at the horse, which was well kept and calm. She looked at the tools strapped to his pack roll, the square and the hand plane and the mallet, all of it wrapped careful in oilcloth against the weather. She said, "The porch step on the east side is rotted through. If you can fix it before dark, you can have supper." It was not a greeting, it was not a welcome exactly, but it was not a refusal, and they both knew it. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and went to find what he needed. Thomas was leaning against the porch post, watching all of this with his particular 11-year-old gravity. When Nathan walked past him to look at the bad step, Thomas fell in alongside him without being asked, the way boys do when they have decided to take a man's measure up close. Nathan hunkered down and ran his hand along the rotten board and said, without looking up, "You'd know this board better than I would. Has it been soft long?" Thomas said, "Since last spring. Mama's been going around it." Nathan nodded, still looking at the wood. He said, "Smart." That was all he said. Thomas stood there a moment longer, then went back inside without a word. June made a supper of bean soup with fatback and cornbread and dried apple preserves from the last of the summer jars. It was honest food, not a woman trying to impress. She set the table for 3 without thinking about it too long, and when Nathan came in from washing at the pump, his hair damp and his collar straightened, he looked at the third place and then at her, and she said, "Thomas eats with us." He said, "I wouldn't have it otherwise." They sat down. It was quiet at first, the way supper is quiet when strangers are in the room. Thomas ate and looked at Nathan from under his eyebrows, in the way boys think is secret and never is. Nathan ate carefully and said the food was good, and meant it, she could tell, because he didn't say it with the extra flourish men put on a compliment when they're trying to sell something. After a while, Thomas said, "Are you going to marry my mother?" June set down her spoon. Nathan looked at the boy directly. He said, "That depends on whether your mother and I can come to an agreement that works for both of us. That's what I'm here to find out." Thomas considered this. He said, "That sounds like a business arrangement." Nathan said, "It is, to start." Thomas looked at his mother. She picked up her spoon again and ate her soup and said nothing, and the wind outside rattled the window pane, and the stove popped once with the heat, and that was supper. Afterward, she showed Nathan the lean-to off the barn, where she'd set up a bunk for him, and told him the terms as she understood them. He would work the farm through the winter. She would provide shelter, food, and $20 in spring if they decided the arrangement wasn't working. If they decided it was, they would go to the preacher in Grover's Crossing and make it legal. She had a farm and a son and a mule named Birdie, and about 4 months of provisions if she stretched them. She was not looking for a husband in the romantic sense of the word. She was looking for a partner. He listened to all of this standing in the lean-to doorway with his hat in his hand, the cold coming in around him, and when she finished he said, "That's plain." "I appreciate it. I've got one question." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "What do you need most?" "Not the farm. You. What's the thing that's been hardest to do alone?" She hadn't expected that question. She stood there in the lantern light and was quiet for a moment that went a little longer than she intended, and then she said, "The roof over the cellar door. It shifts in hard wind, and I've had to repack it 3 times. One good storm could ruin everything I've put down there for winter." He nodded. He said, "I'll look at it tomorrow." She handed him the extra lantern and walked back to the house across the frozen grass. She did not look back, but she heard him go into the lean-to and close the door quietly, and she thought that was a reasonable thing, the way he did it. Not a slam, just a close. November deepened and the cellar roof got fixed, which was the first thing, and then the east porch step, which he'd already done, and then the gap under the kitchen door, which he stuffed with cedar shim stock he cut himself and fitted so cleanly that the draft stopped entirely on the first try. And June stood in the kitchen that evening and noticed the absence of cold the way you notice when a sound you've lived with finally stops. She stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She said nothing about it. Nathan was methodical. He rose before she did and saw to the animals and had the fire stoked by the time she came out to start breakfast. He did not try to take over her kitchen. He sat where she pointed and he ate what she put in front of him, and he said thank you, in a way that was neither excessive nor absent. He had a carpenter's habit of looking at things, at the door frame, at the ceiling joint, at the way the floor had settled near the window, cataloging repairs the way other men counted money. She caught him doing it and said once, dry as paper, "You don't have to fix everything in a week." He said, "No, but I like knowing what's there." She understood that, actually. She did the same thing with accounts. Thomas had decided something about Nathan by the end of the first week, though he did not announce it. What he announced was less, a willingness to be in the same room without surveillance, to answer questions when they were asked, to show Nathan where the second axe was kept and where the mud got deep along the south fence after rain. Small things, door-opening things. Nathan accepted each one without making too much of it, and June watched this from a distance and felt something she didn't have a good word for. The cold settled in for real in late November, the kind that made the horses lean together in the barn and kept the pump handle stiff until 10 in the morning. Nathan split enough wood to stack it 4 feet high along the north wall of the house, and he did it in 2 days of hard work that left him moving a little carefully at the end of the second evening, though he didn't say so. June noticed anyway. She left a jar of the willow bark liniment on the lean-to step without comment. It was gone the next morning. Nothing was said. On the 1st of December, Elias Broom rode by on his way into town and stopped at the fence when he saw Nathan in the yard. He looked at Nathan and then at the house and said, loud enough to carry, "I see you've got a hired man, June." The word hired landed with a particular weight. June was on the porch with a basket of laundry and she said, evenly, "I see you've got your good hat on a Tuesday, Elias. Must be a special occasion." Nathan didn't look up from the fence post he was setting. Elias rode on. Thomas, who had heard all of it from the barn door, came out and said to Nathan he asked her to marry him in September. Nathan drove the post another inch and said, "How'd that go?" Thomas said, "How do you think?" Nathan almost smiled. She could see the almost of it from 20 feet away. The town of Grover's Crossing had opinions about the arrangement, the way small towns always do. The preacher, Brother Aldous, stopped her after service one Sunday in early December and asked, with genuine kindness and no small amount of curiosity, whether she was sure about her situation. She told him she was sure about her cellar roof and her wood supply and her kitchen floor, all of which had improved considerably, and that she would let him know about the rest when she'd had time to properly assess it. He said that seemed prudent, which she suspected was his way of saying he approved without committing himself. Mrs. Garland at the dry goods store was less diplomatic. She asked directly whether June thought it was seemly to have a man living on the place without benefit of clergy. June bought her flour and her needles and said she would pass along Mrs. Garland's concern to Brother Aldous and let the two of them work it out. Nathan, to his credit, did not ask her what people were saying. He seemed to understand that she would manage it, and that offering to manage it for her would be the wrong kind of help. Instead, he made her a shelf. It was a small thing, a pine shelf for the kitchen wall above the dry sink, the kind that a person could set a few useful things on: a tin of salt, a jar of matches, the almanac she consulted more than she would admit. He put it up one evening while she was in the other room with Thomas going over the boys' lessons, and she came out and found it there, level and smooth and fitted to the wall like it had always been. She ran her hand along the edge of it. The wood was planed to silk. She put the salt tin on it and the matches and the almanac. Then she went to the door of the lean-to and said, "The shelf is good work." He was reading by his lantern. He said, "Figured you needed one." She said, "I did." She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than made any practical sense, and then she went to bed. The shelf was the first thing she saw in the morning. December brought a storm that was not the worst storm June had ever seen, but was ambitious in that direction. It blew in on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning, the world had gone white and muffled, and the temperature had dropped enough that you could feel it before you even opened the door, just in the way the air inside the house changed its texture. The drifts along the north fence were waist-high. The barn needed checking. June was pulling on her second pair of wool stockings when she heard Nathan already across the yard, moving through the dark toward the barn with the lantern. She watched from the kitchen window and let him go, which was not something she would have done easily even a month ago, letting someone else handle a part of the work without her. She put the coffee on instead. It was the first time she had done that, made the coffee for him, rather than having it already made when he came in. He came back in out of the white and stomped the snow from his boots on the porch and reported that the animals were all right, that he'd retied the barn door latch which had worked loose in the wind, and that there was a weak spot developing in the roof of the south lean-to that he'd need to address when the storm broke. He sat down at the table and she put the coffee in front of him, and he looked at the cup and then at her, and she said, "Don't make something of it." He said, "No, ma'am," but the corner of his mouth moved. Thomas came in from doing his morning chores with his hair full of snow and his ears red, and he sat down and told Nathan with great enthusiasm and some technical inaccuracy how the Romans had survived snowstorms, because he had been reading about Romans. Nathan listened with complete seriousness and asked a question about Roman building practices that kept Thomas talking for 20 minutes, and June stood at the stove and let the sound of it fill the kitchen, a boy's voice and a man's voice going back and forth, and she had to be very still for a moment because the sound of it was something she hadn't realized she'd been missing until it was there. The storm kept them all in for 2 days. They played cards in the evening, the three of them, a game Thomas had invented that had rules only Thomas fully understood, but which Nathan played with apparent goodwill and occasional creative interpretation. June caught herself laughing on the second evening, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't had in a while. Nathan heard it and didn't look at her directly, but something in him settled. She could see it, a small easing of a tension she had not previously noticed he was carrying. On the third morning the storm broke and the sun hit the snow so hard it hurt to look at, and Nathan went out to fix the south lean-to roof, and June went to milk the mule, Bertie being a mule and not actually providing milk, as Thomas solemnly informed any visitor who missed this distinction, and Thomas went to dig a path from the house to the barn, which he did with the thoroughness of an engineer. It was an ordinary morning. It was the most ordinary morning she had spent in 4 years, and she did not yet know what to do with that. The cold did what cold does. It made time compress and deepen at once. December moved with a slow, close wait, the three of them learning each other's habits the way people do when they cannot easily escape each other. June learned that Nathan went quiet before he spoke about anything important, a pause so brief you might miss it if you weren't watching. She was watching. Nathan learned that June thought best on her feet, that she would circle a problem on her way between the stove and the table, working through it in motion, and that if you needed her to make a decision, you gave her room and did not press her. Thomas learned that Nathan could whistle any hymn from memory, and that he knew which constellations were which, and Thomas considered both of these things strong evidence of a serious character. January brought a new trouble. Magnus Holt owned the land claim on the creek that fed June's south field, and at the start of the new year he had a lawyer from the territorial capital write to say that a survey error had been identified and that her use of that creek water was no longer established by any legal instrument. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, and June read it 3 times at the kitchen table without speaking. Nathan watched her read it and did not ask until she set it down. She slid it across the table to him, and he read it, and then he folded it carefully and set it back in front of her, and said, "When was the original deed recorded?" She said, 1887, February. My husband filed it, he said. Then the survey error, if there is one, existed before you came to the land. You didn't create it. Any court in the territory would need to take that into account. He paused. You need a copy of the original deed. Do you have it? She did. She had every piece of paper relating to the farm in a tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom, which she had not told Nathan about, but she went and got it now without hesitation, which told them both something. He spent that evening reading through the documents at the kitchen table by lamplight, going through each one slowly, and in the morning he said he would ride into Grover's Crossing and talk to the land agent there, who knew the territorial law, and she said she would come with him. He looked at her. She said, "It's my land. I'll be there when it's discussed." He said, "I wasn't about to suggest otherwise." They rode into town together, Thomas staying home with strict instructions and a list of tasks written in June's precise hand. In town, they saw the land agent, a sharp-minded man named Fowler who spread the deed out on his desk and said after about 3 minutes of careful reading that Holt's claim was thin at best, and that the use of that creek water had been continuous and documented for 6 years, which in the territory established a form of right regardless of the survey. He said he would write to Holt's lawyer and advise them to abandon their argument. He did not think they would pursue it. On the ride home, June was quiet for most of the way. Then she said, "Thank you for coming with me." Nathan said, "You didn't need me there." She said, "No, but I was glad you were." The silence after that was a different kind of silence, not the careful silence of 2 strangers, something warmer and less easy to explain. That was the middle of January. By early February, Thomas had decided that he was done waiting. June knew her son well enough to know when he was building to something. She could see it in the way he watched Nathan, the way he was particularly quiet at supper. On a Wednesday evening she was at the dry sink and Nathan was doing something at the table, some small repair on a piece of harness, and Thomas came in and sat down across from Nathan and put his hands flat on the table. He said, "I think you should stay." Nathan looked at him. June kept her hands in the wash water and did not turn around. Thomas said, "I know what the arrangement is. She told me, because she tells me things, and I know it's up to her, but I'm saying my part of it." He looked at the harness and then at Nathan. "The farm is better with you here. She laughs more, and you know the stars." He said this last thing as though it clinched the argument. Nathan was quiet for a moment in that particular way he had before he said something real. Then he said, "I appreciate that, Thomas. It means a lot to me, more than you'd probably expect." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. He got up and went to bed, and the door to his room closed, and the kitchen was very quiet. June turned around. Her hands were still damp. She dried them on her apron, and she stood there and looked at Nathan, who was looking at the harness in front of him with great attention. She said, "He's not wrong." Nathan looked up at her. He said, Which part? She said, Any of it. A pause, the laughing especially. He set the harness down very carefully, like it might break if he wasn't deliberate about it. He said, June, I want to say something plain. She said, All right. He said this started out as a contract. That was honest, and I meant to hold to it. But somewhere between the shelf and the storm and the 2 days of cards, it stopped feeling like a contract to me. I don't want $20 in the spring. I want— He stopped. He looked at the shelf above the dry sink, the one he'd made, with the salt tin and the almanac on it. He said, I want to build you another shelf, and fix whatever else needs fixing, and sit across from that boy while he explains Roman engineering. I want to stay, is what I'm saying, if you're willing. June looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 7 men who had come before him, and she understood now that what had been wrong with all of them was not that they were bad men, but that they had been offering her something less than this, something easier and therefore smaller. She said, The arrangement would need to be different. He said, I know. She said, We'd go to Brother Aldous. He said, Whatever you think is right. She said, I think it's right. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and took 2 steps toward her, and she didn't step back, and he said, Then I'd like to shake your hand on it, and mean it differently than I did the first time. She held out her hand, and he took it, and they shook, and neither of them let go right away. They went to Grover's Crossing on a Thursday in late February, when the air had the first thin suggestion of something gentler in it, not yet spring but moving toward the idea. Brother Aldous married them in the church with Mrs. Garland as witness, because she was there picking up the church order, and asked so directly if she could attend that it seemed unkind to refuse. The ceremony was brief and exact. Nathan said the words like he'd thought about them before he said them. June said hers looking at him directly, the way she did everything. After, on the church steps, Thomas shook Nathan's hand with great seriousness, and Nathan received it that way. Mrs. Garland cried a little and said she had known all along it would work out, which June let pass without comment. They drove home in the wagon through the last of the winter cold, and the land on both sides of the road looked tired and waiting, the way land does in late February when it's been under snow for months. It was not yet beautiful. It would be. June knew this country. She knew what it looked like when the grass came back and the creek ran full and the cottonwoods put their green out against the blue of the sky. And she knew what it would mean to see it that way this year, with a man beside her who had chosen to stay in the hard time, before it was beautiful, before it was easy, when it was still just work and cold and a roof that needed fixing and a boy who needed to hear 2 voices going back and forth across a kitchen table. She reached over and put her hand on Nathan's arm where he held the reins. He looked at her. She looked at the road ahead. After a moment he shifted the reins to one hand and covered her hand with his, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, through the cold and the quiet, with Thomas asleep in the wagon bed behind them. And the spring came, the way it always does, sure and slow and better than you remembered it being. There are those who will tell you that a marriage of convenience is a lesser thing, that love must arrive first, or it does not count. This story asks you to consider otherwise. What June and Nathan built, they built the way a good carpenter builds anything, carefully, with honest materials, one true joint at a time. The pact became a partnership, and the partnership became a home. And the home became something neither of them had dared to name when they first shook hands in the cold. Perhaps that is how the best things come to us, not in a rush, but in the doing. What do you think? Have you seen love grow from something practical and plain? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what struck you about June and Nathan's story. And if these Old West journeys speak to your heart, please subscribe. There are more waiting for you. Good night. God bless you and yours.